first one today is Marjan Ehsassi, who is from the United States, from Washington, D.C., who, after a life working in development, started getting interested in citizen assemblies, did a PhD on citizen assemblies, observed many different processes from up close, looking especially at how it affected participants. In the meantime, you're a Berggruen fellow, you're an IDEA senior fellow. I would have a long time standing here listing everything you've done in the meantime in this field, but most specifically, you were one of the members of the Collège des Garants, the Oversight Committee of the National Assembly in France on end of life, on changing the law on euthanasia. That's the one you're going to talk about. You've also been in the Oversight Committee in my country on an assembly on party finance, and you've been involved in several assemblies observing or writing about them. So thank you for being here, coming from the States to talk to us about something in France, which is a bit also a second home to you a little bit. So Marjan, thank you for being here, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Yves. Thank you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes? Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Yves. Welcome to day 2. We had a wonderful day 1 with incredible speakers, starting with Yves' presentation, and then Ian and Damir, and then the wonderful workshops, and then, of course, our great dinner with, thanks to our friends at Citra and FIDE. Thank you so much. So big shoes to fill today. And so I have been asked, as Yves sort of described, to talk to you a little bit for about 10 minutes about sort of the French National Citizens Convention on the end of life for about 10 minutes, and then more specifically for about 20 minutes or so about the provision of information. And so, by way of context, just to add to what Yves said, I think it's important to understand that I came to this really the first few years with my doctoral degree looking at citizen disengagement. That was really my interest, and so I really looked at citizens' assemblies as a possible democratic innovation to re-engage citizens. And so I spent a lot of time thinking, researching, doing case studies on that. And last year I was fortunate to be selected as one of 4 members of the Collège des Garants, as Yves mentioned, of the Citizens Assembly on the end of life. And so there are a few things that I just wanted to mention. You each have a shortcut that I wrote with the Bertelsmann Stiftung, I think, on your right by your tables. There are also 2 other documents that if you're interested, I encourage you to take a look at. One is a New Democracy piece that we wrote thanks to Ian Walker, who I think had to leave for the airport, and Kyle Redman. Those are available to you. And then lastly, an article that I wrote in Noema magazine on the impact on participants, and I compared the first French convention on the end of life with this convention, drawing from interviews that I did mostly with participants, but also some organizers. And that is entitled Putting the Public Back into Policy. And sort of, I talk about the transformative potential of citizens' assemblies. And I choose that rather deliberately because, at least in my research, I feel that we often take for granted the impact on citizens and the potential of citizens' assemblies. And I think that is why I think platforms such as these and schools that, citizens' assembly schools that FIDE organizes, I think, are of great value because it allows all of us to come together and really share best practices and learn from each other. And I think we all leave thinking more about the ways in which we need to design and implement our citizens' assemblies so that they can really, so the practice and potential of citizens' assemblies are more aligned. So with that, let's move a little bit to some of the sort of the broader sort of brushstrokes of the Citizens Convention on the end of life. President Macron made a commitment during his second election of the campaign to convene a national debate, a national deliberative debate around the issue of euthanasia and the end of life. Most polls suggest that about 70 to 80% of French citizens wanted a change in the law, and so he made this commitment to convene a national debate on this. The First Minister, Elisabeth Borne, sent a request to the CESU. Now, some of you may be familiar with the first Citizens Convention in France on the climate, and I think we'll hear more about that this afternoon. So the CESU at the time, in 2019-2020, was an institution that was chosen to convene the first National Convention on the climate. Since 2019-20, a law was adopted that basically made the CESU, which is the Council for Economic, Social and Environmental Affairs, the law allowed the CESU to become the third assembly of the French Republic and responsible for any kind of national citizen engagement. So their power, of course, was enhanced, and the First Minister asked the CESU to convene this Citizens Assembly to discuss the end of life. And the question, the remit, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts after we discussed this yesterday, the remit I think was rather clear. It is two questions though, and it said, is the end of life support framework adapted to the different situations encountered, or should any changes be introduced? So of course, the first part was determining whether the current framework, the current law was sufficient, and if not, then how it needed to be changed. So that was the mandate. So just a few facts about the Citizens Convention. We had 185 participants who were chosen, and this is truly remarkable. We only lost one participant throughout the 9 weekends. And the one participant that we lost was because they didn't have a job before, and they were able to find employment, and they weren't able to leave on Fridays and Saturdays and join us for those weekend events. So we only lost one person. The sortition, going back to recruitment yesterday, we followed 6 criteria: gender, age, region, educational level, socio-professional categories, and urban, rural, and peri-urban categories as well were important to us. As I said, we went for 9 weekends starting in December of last year until April. So 27 days of commitment. The participants did receive a stipend. It was about 80, 90 euros a day. So it was about, I think, 2,400 per person at the end of their commitment. The final report, including the 65 proposals, was approved with a 92% approval rating, which we did the vote at the very last session to see if they approved of the process that was followed. And the cost of, okay, so 76% also voted in favor of the introduction, so fairly similar to the polling that we had beforehand. And of course, they cost an astronomical 5 million euros. And so as Zakia mentioned yesterday, this was kind of, in terms of resources, this was a dream convention. This is kind of the actors, and as you can see, it was rather cumbersome. There were lots of different players. I'll just go through them really quickly. We had the governance committee, which was made up of 14 individuals. 6 of them were members of the CESU, including the president. And then there were experts in citizen participation, philosophers, and we also included 2 members of the previous French Convention on the climate, which was a wonderful decision to make, and they made very valuable contributions throughout the event. The steering committee was made up mostly of the CESU sort of administrative staff, as well as the facilitators who were kind of putting the program together and running it by the governance committee and the guarantors. So the operational implementations, as you can see, I don't need to go through them. The people interviewed in terms of support, the fact checkers, the writers, and then the guarantors. This was a bit different. I mean, our role, again, you know, this looks rather cumbersome, but it's much like relationship building in any citizens assembly. It was very successful in the way that we came together. So the facilitators, the governance committee, and the guarantors, we were invited to every meeting. So we weren't really sort of these independent, kind of neutral, stand back, arm's length guarantors. We were involved in almost all the meetings. And we really worked together very well. And I think from the very beginning, everyone's intention was really for this convention to be as successful as possible. And that really showed in the way that we evolved and we made decisions together. And then, of course, we had neutral observers. One party that is not on this graph, but I will mention it, just it doesn't relate to evidence, but it's an important piece, are the graphic artists. We introduced graphic artists from the very first session, and they started doing drawings of their conversations with each of the different participants, and they created a tree of how the conversation was progressing. And it was so liked by the participants that we actually included some of their drawings in the final report. And I think it was also a great addition to the entire process. So just some facts, just quickly. You know, we had an evolving co-creation process. So we talked about this, and I'm not going to get into details. I'm happy to talk to anybody who's interested later on. The process evolved. From the very beginning, participants were asking to have co-decision-making powers, and they wanted to be present in the governance committee. That took a while, but we were able to evolve that and give them more and more sort of co-decision power as we went along. Another really good introduction here was that the participants were able to meet with President Macron at the Élysée and present their recommendations, and he at that meeting made the commitment and asked and requested that the Assemblée nationale present a legal framework for the change in the law by the end of the summer. Now, that has not happened yet. We just had a meeting 2 weeks ago in Paris. The understanding is that there will be an introduction of a legal framework that will then have to be seasoned sometime end of October, November is the promise that was made. And then, as I mentioned, sort of the institution of the CESE, which I think is an important institution to have. Finally, you know, just quickly, I do think some of the things that we need to think about a little bit more in the context of this national convention, hopefully for the next one that will hopefully happen sometime in 2024. The selection of the topic. I think we need to think a little bit more seriously about how we can find ways to marry, of course, political will, but also allow citizens to make a selection on the topics that government, that, you know, a mayor is willing to move on. I think we do need more robust co-creation processes going into citizens' assemblies. I think we need to have developed plans that allow for citizens to take more of a role in the decision-making of everyday sessions. And then a stronger connection with the public. I think we need to do better there. But in the end, as I put in the shortcut, I do think that, you know, we often talk about whether citizens' assemblies should be binding, whether their recommendations should be binding. And I think that as long as there is political will, a consultative mandate can also really provide participants with consequential voice at the end. So moving on to the provision of information. Just a few caveats. These are really general guidelines. I'm really drawing these guidelines mostly from one perspective, and that's really to explain to you how this happened in the context of the French Convention on the End of Life. It's really meant to provoke discussion, and I want to hear from you about what's worked for you, what hasn't worked for you, so that in the end we can really sort of improve our own understanding. So just quickly, I'll try and define information here, and I'm going to miss out on a lot because we don't have that much time, but I'm going to try and very quickly talk about who made the decision making, what was selected, what kind of information we were talking about, how, considerations about sequencing of the information, which I think are very important, if we can get to access and storage and how you sort of make that information available not just to the participants but also to the public. And then the role of participants in this process as well, and curating information, and then some final thoughts. So what is information? Information refers to the sum of all the materials that are curated, collected, and shared with participants before, during, and after a citizens' assembly, which should be there as well. This includes all the program and issue-related written materials, including the reports and the articles, as well as presentations made by experts, testimonials, feedback from the public, skills workshops, and site visits where they happen, also referred to as content, documentation, evidence, and/or data. Now, why is information important to a citizens' assembly? In an age of polarization, of course, being able to provide your citizens as they're going through the learning process with balanced information is incredibly important. The importance of providing that quality information so that you can then have real learning that then leads to considered judgment and good proposals is incredibly important. And then more generally, not just about the issue that you're dealing, but clear and consistent communication on all sorts of things, whether it's roles, whether it's expectations, all of that leads to hugely different success or no success in a citizens' assembly. And here I just wanted to mention, sometimes we're questioned about how much learning actually does happen as a citizens' assembly and whether people do change their positions. A report that was just released that is not made public yet, but it was the internal evaluation of the Citizens' Convention on the End of Life. Their surveys demonstrate that about 53% of our 185 citizens said that at one point or another they changed their opinion on things throughout the Citizens' Assembly, throughout the 9 months, which I thought was quite remarkable. So just generally, some operating principles. Neutrality, impartiality, and balance, of course, is very important. Inclusion, equity, and diversity of contradictory viewpoints is really important to the extent that it's possible. And then transparency and justifiability. And by this, I really mean being able to, with the selection of experts and the materials that you're presenting to your citizens, really being able to justify why you've made those decisions. So in the case of the French Citizens' Convention on the End of Life, as I said, the governance committee was really the body that made the decisions on the experts. I'm not sure that that's the best decision because the governance committee was also involved in making decisions on other things. So the administration, the processes, the way that we came to writing the recommendations, the facilitation, all of that was being governed by the governance committee. However, I mean, when I said that, we had 6 members of the CESU and then 8 members who are experts, those experts actually did represent both issue experts. So we had members of the National Ethics Committee from France who were involved. We also had ethics experts on citizens' participation, as well as experts from the palliative care centers in France. So they were quite qualified to choose and to select experts, but whether there should be a distance or not is actually, I think, a question that's worthy of debate. Some other ideas, for instance, on processes that may not have a governance committee, but then do have steering committees for the selection of topic experts. In Petaluma, California, 2 years ago, they actually had an information advisory committee, and I was involved with that as well. That was made up of members of the community that some had issue knowledge and some did not. So they were the ones who presented the list of experts. And Yves mentioned the G1000 citizens panel that I was involved with. They had an oversight committee, and Art and I were both on that oversight committee. And part of the responsibility of the oversight committee was also to okay selections that were made by the implementing partner, the G1000, on the experts. So different models that are used. And then, of course, on the who of who selects the experts and the information, you always want to make sure that there's consistent feedback from the participants by way of a survey at the end of every session to understand what else they need to hear, who else they want to see, and giving them those types of abilities and sort of platforms as well. The what of information, this is really important. I think that, and I brought a copy if anyone is interested in seeing this. This is the starter kit that everybody received at the beginning of the first, and I think it's actually done quite well. It talks about sort of processes, but also more generally about the law. So everybody had a copy of where the current law stands, what the analysis was, and everything else. So those are really important pieces. Do I have about 10 more minutes? Is that, yes? Yeah, about 5 more? Okay. All right, so I'm going to go through this really quickly, but again, I'm happy to talk to anybody if you'd like to discuss this in more detail. So the written materials are there, experts and testimonies. So in the case of the French Convention on the End of Life, we actually had over 61 experts who were invited. Interestingly, we had 56% who were not in favor of changes in the law, 38% that were in favor, and 6% with neutral positions. Site visits, I can't overestimate how important these are. With 185 participants, we weren't able to organize site visits for them, but okay, thank you. All right. We weren't able to organize site visits for them, but what we did do is we managed to put a list together of different palliative care centers, different hospitals, different places that they could then arrange to go and visit. And a lot of the participants did take advantage of this and went in groups of 8, 10, 12 to visit the different hospitals and the sites. So this was a challenge for us, but one that I think is really, really important. So the how of the delivery, I think this is really important as well. So of course you have the written documents, experts and testimonies. This is something that we talk about quite often. Most of the time, at least in my experience, we have presentations that are made by experts. All of my surveys, my own personal surveys for my doctoral degree, and surveys that I have since seen, citizens want debate. They want us to put the different experts in conversation with each other. And I don't think we do that enough. We did a few panels during the French Convention on the End of Life that were very well received by the citizens. So that's something that, of course, I put down skilled moderators. You need to make sure that your moderators know how to balance those conversations and the different presentations that are given. Interactive. So yes, you have, Yes, you have the experts presenting, but you also want to provide not only plenary sessions where there are larger discussions, but also small group discussions. I also would encourage, much like we're doing here, for you to give space to your citizens to prepare their questions before. Once they know that there's an expert coming, either before they can do this in groups, they can do this individually, but it really does help. Creating pauses. We didn't have any pauses during the French Convention on the End of Life. I think we would have really, really benefited from that, giving space during the structured day. Because once they're home, they don't really want to think about, most of them don't. Some do, some continue to be engaged, but for the most part, they don't. And then also creating space for experts to come back. Often, even with our 27 days, we didn't have time for experts to come back. Citizens asked for some of the experts to come back once they understood the subject area a little bit more, and we weren't able to provide for that. So I think that is really something that's important to build in. The sequencing. So here, I think a couple things that I put down that I'd love to share with you is building trust. So most of our mandates, most of the remits are pretty complicated, and it does create conflict. And I wish that we could sort of say that we did this on purpose. We didn't do this on purpose, but we began the French Convention on the End of Life with common points. So we started with meeting with palliative care specialists, which really brought the citizens together and built a lot of social cohesion before we got into the more complicated conversations around euthanasia and the end of life. And that was really brilliant because you could see the entire group coalescing around their common convictions. Some of the participants were very, very frustrated by this. They walked in the first session and all they wanted to do was talk about the end of life and changing the law. And, you know, we had to manage those expectations. But in the end, it worked really well because, as I said, there was this social cohesion. And if you happen to read the final report that was published by the citizens, we also had a manifest at the beginning that was written by a group that was selected by the citizens. And it's a brilliant manifest, and you see how united they were despite their differences. Again, you know, I mentioned this briefly, but making sure that you have enough space for minority voice. I mean, we really, one of the comments that has stayed with all of us is, who were involved, was one of the most kind of staunch advocates of no change in the law. At the last session, when we were going through reflections of the process, she said, thank you to the 76% for giving us 50% of time. And that was really telling. So we worked really hard to create as many platforms as we could for the minority voice to have space. And then, of course, you know, we had resources. So we had coaches, we had mentors. As soon as there were some issues, we could find a coach who would then go make sure that things were good. One of the things we didn't do, and this is, I'll just throw this, is not about evidence, but it's about taking care of our participants, is the idea of having coaching systems after the Citizens Assemblies. We often say, you know, this is an incredible experience. Someone mentioned yesterday, you know, after having a child, this was the biggest highlight of someone's life, an assembly member's life. I don't think we take that into consideration enough in kind of structuring our citizens' assemblies so that there is some follow-up afterwards for those people who are actually having trouble reintegrating into their lives. So access, maybe we can talk about this later if anybody wants to. Then the role of participants. I do want to sort of stress this in the couple minutes that I have left, but making sure, obviously, that there are opportunities for real Q&A, not neglecting that, and giving them space for this collective learning is really important. We created a suggestion box because some people didn't want to write emails, didn't really have access to emails after, so there was a suggestion box, and a lot of people dropped notes in there for experts that they wanted to see, reports that they wanted to have, all of those things. So that physical thing that we don't think about very often anymore is valuable to them. End of session questionnaires, as I mentioned before, asking them to sort of tell you if there are other experts, other areas that they've identified as gaps. Self-organized interviews and visits. I mentioned that kind of under site visits, but a lot of our participants organized their own conversations with especially people who were not well, who had made decisions to leave and go to Switzerland or go to Belgium to be able to access different services. There were quite a few calls that I actually participated in as well with the participants. And then there are questions around the distribution and adding of documents. Should there be an approval? Some of the organizations that came wanted to add some documents to the storage that we had, and there should be a process. What do you accept? What do you not accept? And also some of the participants want to share documents with their friends, so with their other participants. We had a WhatsApp group that people would populate with documents, and that was their own. We did not monitor that. But if they want to add to the collective storage, which is also accessible to the public, then you might want to think a little bit about what type of documents you're going to accept. And then this we talked about whether they should have a place on the governance or the expert committees. I think that's a real question, I think once they have participated for a session or so, or a day or two, I think it's a wise idea to rotate participants onto that. So some final thoughts, for enhanced learning and deliberation, which then leads to more considered judgment and better proposals. I think preparing questions and allowing the pauses, as we talked about, around misinformation, disinformation, making sure that you can justify the choices that you've made around experts, coaches, fact checkers, processes and standards, and then making sure that there is greater participant engagement in the selection of your evidence as well. Thank you.